Hello, everyone. Welcome. My name is Marion Fourcade. I am the director of Social Science Matrix, and I'm very, very pleased to welcome you today to our event on Carolyn Chen's new book, Work, Pray, Code. I know we have a big audience online as well, so welcome to you too. And I'll be both introducing and moderating this panel. I love this book, and I am so excited about the conversation we are about to have. I am excited because it's such a quintessentially important topic, how people find meaning in their lives and how the institutions they are part of shape those meanings. I'm excited because it's Silicon Valley, which I'm a bit obsessed about, and which I guess never ceases to fascinate everyone. Seemingly both the place where culture goes to die and the place where culture is regenerated. I'm excited because the book is really a nod to and a beautiful exemplar of a classical sociological approach to religion and also a classical sociological approach to work. And I'm excited because we have a stellar lineup to discuss this really important contribution. So today's event is part of our Authors Meets Critics series, which features critically engaged discussions about recent books by faculty and alumni in UC Berkeley's Social Sciences Division. Today's panel is co-sponsored by the Berkeley Culture Center, an initiative at Berkeley has focused on uncovering different facets of culture within and across organizations and industries. And it is also co-sponsored by the Berkeley Center for the Study of Religion, which advances creative and critical scholarship on religion, and of which Professor Chen is co-director. And we would like to note that Princeton Press is offering, a 30% discount on the book. You can see the code on your slide right there. Okay, as always, before we start the panel, I will mention a few upcoming events for Matrix. First, we have an Author Meets Critic panel on October 10 about the book Voices in the Code, a story about people, their values, and the algorithm they made by David Robinson, who is a visiting scholar at Matrix and a member of the faculty at Apple University. We will have an Author Meets Critic panel also on October 14, featuring Derek Scott's book, Keeping It Unreal, Comics and Black Queer Fantasy. And finally, we have a Matrix on Point event on the court and the people, featuring experts from Berkeley on the most recent season of Supreme Court decisions. So, many more exciting events throughout the semester. You can find them on Matrix website. So let me now turn to the main event. Let me just say, by way of introduction, that Work, Pray, Code it is an extraordinarily rich deep dive into the new ways that religion enters people's lives in an increasingly secular age. One crucial channel, it turns out, is work, or rather the corporation. So I hope I am not stealing the authors or the discussants' fire here, but you probably got this one big insight from the book's title already. Professor Chen offers a really close-up look at how tech firms in Silicon Valley rely on elements of religious practice to foster work commitment and productivity. And so not only has religion become secularized as work discipline, but work has been imbued with quasi-religious significance, and the place where people pour their souls. Carolyn Chen is a sociologist, actually a Berkeley PhD in sociology, and she's associate professor of ethnic studies here at Berkeley, and as I said earlier, the co-director of the Berkeley Center for the Study of Religion. Her research focuses on Asian American religion, as well as religion and work in the new economy. Carolyn is the author of Getting Saved in America, Taiwanese Immigration and Religious Experience, which came out from Princeton in 2008, and she's the co-editor of Sustaining Faith Traditions, Religion, Race, and Ethnicity Among the Latino and Asian American Second Generation. And to discuss Professor Chen's latest contribution, we are so fortunate to have Arlie Hochschild and Morgan Ames. Professor Hochschild needs no introduction perhaps, but I will still oblige out of respect for ritual Arlie is professor of sociology emerita at the University of California, Berkeley. She is the author of 9 books, indeed, several of the arguably most successful books and influential books to come out in the field of sociology. Let me cite just a few: The Managed Heart, The Commercialization of Intimate Life, The Second Shift, Working Parents and the Revolution at Home, and The Time Bind, When Home Becomes Work and Work Becomes Home. And finally, her latest book, Strangers in Their Own Land, was a finalist for the National Book Award and the New York Times bestseller. From the ASA, Professor Hochschild has been awarded the Jesse Bernard Award, the Charles Cooley Award, and the Award for Public Understanding of Sociology. And her work appears in 17 languages. Morgan Ames now is an assistant professor of practice in the School of Information and associate director of research for the Center for Science, Technology, Medicine and Society here at Berkeley. She researches the ideological origins of inequality in the technology world with a focus on utopianism, childhood, and learning. Her book, The Charisma Machine, The Life, Death, and Legacy of One Laptop Per Child, draws on archival research and ethnographic fieldwork in Paraguay to explore the cultural history, the results, and the legacy of the One Laptop Per Child project. The book won the 2020 Best Information Science Book Award, the 2020 Sally Hacker Prize, and the 2021 Computer History Museum Prize. Our next project extends the questions regarding the interaction between computers, ideology, and identity to explore the role that utopianism plays in discourses around childhood, education, and development in Silicon Valley and the San Francisco Bay Area. So without further ado, let's hear from Carolyn.
Thank you for that generous introduction, Marion. And I want to thank you and Julia, Sizek, and the rest of the Matrix team for organizing this event. I also want to thank Kai Nguyen and Patty Dunlap from the Berkeley Center for the Study of Religion for co-sponsoring, and also for the Berkeley Cultural Center for co-sponsoring. And then finally, Dr. Morgan Ames and Dr. Arlie Hochschild, thank you so much. You're 2 scholars that I really greatly respect, and I so appreciate you taking the time to read and seriously engage with my book. I'm so excited about the conversation that we're going to be having after. So I came to the study of work in Silicon Valley by accident. I started this project wanting to understand the nature of religion in contemporary American life, and I ended up in a tech firm. Let me explain. I am a scholar of religion, a sociologist of religion to be exact, and like most religion scholars, I study people, places, and things that identify with a religious tradition. So Hinduism, Christianity, Buddhism. But in most metropolitan areas today, fewer and fewer Americans identify as religious. In fact, the fastest growing religious group in the United States are religious nones, N-O-N-E-S, those who don't identify with a religious tradition at all. And I was interested in capturing religion's presence among this group. But how do you study religion among the non-religious? So I tried to get at that answer at first by looking at religion and spirituality in secular spaces. And I started by studying yoga practitioners. So yoga's origins are religious, but it occupies this in-between quasi-religious, quasi-spiritual space, but is largely treated as secular. And I asked yoga practitioners about how, when, and why they practiced yoga. But they kept talking to me about work. They said that they practice yoga because it helps them to relax and de-stress from work, and that it helped them to become a better, and here you can fill in the blank, lawyer, doctor, engineer, teacher, etc. I had gone in thinking that yoga was a sacred practice because of its connection to Hinduism, but I was mistaken. Yoga wasn't sacred, work was. Yoga practitioners told me stories about how they had sacrificed and surrendered their time, energy, and devotion to work. They claimed that they suffered divorces, estranged relationships from kids, headaches, backaches, and anxiety because of work. They were sacrificing, surrendering, and submitting to work. And according to Emil Durkheim, they had set their work apart and made it sacred. So I realized that I've been looking for the sacred in the wrong place. If I really wanted to understand religion in contemporary America, I needed to be studying the workplace. And so in the summer of 2013, my husband and I packed up our Subaru and our 2 toddlers and moved from Chicago to Palo Alto. I was teaching at Northwestern at the time, which landed us in the belly of the beast of 21st century capitalism. I spent the next 5 years studying Silicon Valley work and spirituality. I interviewed over 100 people in the industry. These were engineers, software programmers, executives, venture capitalists, and also the people who serviced and supported them. These are HR professionals, meditation and mindfulness teachers, executive coaches, and more. As an ethnographer, I hung out with tech workers. I had many gourmet lunches. I attended exercise and dance classes. I attended professional development seminars and executive coach trainings. And yes, I even participated in trance dance. And I meditated with tech workers a lot. So the main argument in Work Precode is this: work is replacing religion among high-skilled Americans. Professionals are looking to work for identity, meaning, purpose, and even transcendence, needs that Americans once turned to religion and other non-work civic institutions to meet. And companies, on their part, have taken up spiritual care and spiritual cultivation as ways to make their workers more productive. The meaning of work has changed for many in late capitalism. And this is transforming how Americans practice religion and spirituality and form communities and civil society, especially in knowledge industry hubs like Silicon Valley. Now, to be sure, Silicon Valley tech companies with their celebrity chefs and meditation rooms are not typical American workplaces. But I argue that the strangeness and the extremeness of Silicon Valley helps us to see more clearly the relationship between 2 broad trends of the last 40 years that have eluded both scholars of work and scholars of religion alike: the expansion of work and the contraction of religion in American life. So work is expanded in the lives of high-skilled Americans by taking ever more of their time and energy, but also by giving and providing for ever more of their social and spiritual needs. The social influence of religion and other civic institutions, on the other hand, has declined. In 1990, only 8% of Americans claimed no religious affiliation. Today, nearly a quarter of them do. And the number of religious nuns has risen fastest in metropolitan areas that have experienced the fastest job growth among professionals, like the Bay Area. But America's highly skilled have not abandoned religion. Instead, they find it at work. More and more companies have become America's new temples, churches, and synagogues. People are not selling their souls at work, rather, work is where they find their souls. So I first started to sense that work was replacing religion when I discovered a very curious pattern among tech workers. So most tech workers are not from Silicon Valley. They move there from somewhere else for work. And I noticed that many of I call them tech migrants, they left their religions after they started working in tech. So one of these people was an engineer that I called John Ashton. And John grew up in Georgia. And like most people in the Bible Belt, he grew up going to church. When he went off to college, he became the president of his Christian fraternity. And then after graduating from college, he took a 9-to-5 job in a bank where he was a computer programmer. And because it was a 9-to-5 job, it gave him ample time to serve in his church by playing the guitar in the band, leading Bible study, and volunteering in the community. But all that changed when he got recruited to just join a startup in Silicon Valley. Now he worked 10 to 16-hour days, 7 days a week. And work took up so much of his time and energy that John had to sacrifice other things in his life, not just sleep and exercise and having a social life outside of work, but also religion. So instead, John channeled all of his religious fervor into work, and his startup became his new faith community and work his new religion. Now his social life and identity revolved around the startup. He and his coworkers ate all their meals together, and when they weren't working, they played video games together, they played the guitar, they went skiing in Lake Tahoe in the winter, they went to Burning Man in the summer. In fact, the amount of time that John spent with them was even more than he'd spent with any faith community he'd ever belonged to. Work also gave John a very clear purpose in life, one that was not so different from Christianity: to transform the world one person, or rather user, at a time. Only John's work did it through technological products and not the gospel. He even used Christian language to describe the company's mission, saying it over and over again to me that he had a, quote, burden to come up with this thing that's going to change the world, end quote. Like Christianity, work also required faith in things unseen. So given the high odds of his startup failing, John repeated what so many other tech workers told me, that, quote, you've got to drink the Kool-Aid. You have to believe that your company is one of those 1 out of 10 that's going to make it. Work also had its own rituals that were similar to Christianity. Instead of Sunday services, the startup had its weekly all-hands meetings, a corporate liturgy orchestrated to inspire the enthusiasm and commitment of the employees. So John was just one of the many tech workers I met who converted to the religion of work after moving to Silicon Valley. But tech workers channeling their religious needs into work is only part of the story. In response to the broad economic changes of the late 20th century, such as the rise of global capitalism and the shift from an industrial to a post-industrial / knowledge economy, corporate America has changed its organizational culture and labor management practices in order to elicit the full discretionary effort of its highly skilled workers. Corporate managers have shifted their metaphor of employees in the company from cogs in an efficient, well-oiled machine to something that increasingly resembles a religious congregation. Members who belong to a shared community and believe in a higher and transcendent goal. So today, companies are not just economic institutions. They've become meaning-making institutions that offer a gospel of fulfillment and divine purpose in a capitalist cosmos. And there's no better example of this than Silicon Valley's tech industry. Companies understand that, as one leading business thinker puts it, quote, meaning is the new money. Workplaces are now in the business of providing meaning and purpose for their workers because this translates to higher performance. Most Fortune 500 companies have adopted the key elements of religious organization: a mission, values, and origin stories, and even a charismatic founder. Everyone that I met in Silicon Valley, they had a personal mission statement that they had perfected into an elevator pitch. In fact, one time I participated in this professional development seminar where we had these small groups and we all had to introduce ourselves by our personal mission statement. And of course it came to me and I was just like tongue-tied, right? They don't teach us that at Berkeley, not yet at least, right? Tech companies actively incorporate spirituality into their cultures as a strategy to grow the value of their human capital. They claim that individual spiritual development increases employee engagement and organizational growth. Companies benefit when employees align the deepest parts of themselves with their work. So one executive coach put it this way, quote, mystery becomes relevant to companies when it unlocks potential, well-being, aliveness. When we operate from that space, it's definitely an ROI, or return on investment, end quote. So companies, increase their ROI through doing things like offering meditation and mindfulness classes. They offer spiritual retreats as part of their wellness benefits. They bring in spiritual and religious leaders to give inspiring talks to their workers. They provide executive coaches to their senior leaders who often teach them spiritual practices and exercises. One founder described his role in the company as the head pastor of the company. Many of the HR folks that I talked to, they use this language of spirituality to describe their work. They talked about bringing wholeness to the workplace. They used words like they were there to nurture the souls of their employees. One executive even described the Silicon Valley workplace as, quote, the hotbed of spirituality. Tech companies encourage their tech workers to bring their whole selves to work through the practice of what I call corporate maternalism. And that's when companies care for the body, mind, and spirit of the workers so that they're happy, healthy, and therefore productive. So we see this in the lavish pre-pandemic provisions and perks of tech companies: the food, the smoothies, nap pods, Zumba classes, laundry service, social clubs, meditation, et cetera. So that work becomes a place that meets all of your material, physical, and spiritual needs. Work changes in meaning here. Work is not just a place to work anymore, but it becomes a place of fulfillment. The director of wellness at one tech firm explained her job to me as getting employees to, quote, experience the workplace as a place to become that fulfilled person, end quote. So it's no wonder that tech workers use words like passion, love, calling, purpose, fulfillment, authenticity, and even joy to describe work. You know, these are the kinds of words that Americans used to reserve for non-work spheres of life, like their families and their faith communities. These are institutions to whom they offer unconditional love and loyalty. So this investment in the wholeness of tech workers reflects the new orientation of labor management and knowledge economies, a shift towards treating high-skilled labor as capital assets to grow and to develop and expand, rather than as cost to be cut as labor was treated in the industrial era. Indeed, I'm convinced that among tech workers, there is no other social institution that is more invested in their fulfillment than their workplaces. But wholeness at work comes at a cost. At a time when many celebrate the holistic workplace that cares for the whole person, the question that one HR professional asked me may make us think twice. She asked me, quote, how much am I going to get out of you if you can't bring your whole self to work? So if workplaces have become the new churches, temples, and mosques in America's knowledge industry hubs, how have the meanings of spiritual and religious traditions and practices changed? I focus in my book on the meaning of Buddhist meditation, also popularly known as mindfulness. One old timer, a human resources professional who moved to San Francisco in the 70s as part of the counterculture, put it best. He said this, quote, back then, it was about sex, drugs, and rock and roll. Now it's about productivity, end quote. Only 50 years prior in the Bay Area, meditation was associated with spiritual quest, expanded consciousness, and turning on, tuning in, and dropping out, to borrow Timothy Leary's famous countercultural mantra. But now meditation has become a productivity practice to turn on and tune in ever more deeply into the capitalist establishment. I argue that this utilitarian approach to meditation is a product of the late 20th century development of shifting the burden of the employment contract from company to employer. Instead of a career being what one person described to me as a committed marriage to one company, it is now a series of flings where people need to work hard to always be attractive and marketable. In tech's fling model of employment, where workers change jobs every 3 to 5 years, work is associated with love, passion, and authenticity, but it is also very precarious. As one HR director explained to me, quote, you're not growing your career on the company's dime anymore. It's on you, end quote. So this new orientation to employment where it's on you creates what I call an ethos of self-optimization in Silicon Valley, so that tech workers are vigilant to optimize their marketability and upgrade their skills. This orientation extends to even their personal habits. what tech workers call biohacking or self-hacking, optimizing their sleep, their diet, their body in order to improve work performance. Now, religious technologies such as fasting and meditation that were once the practice of the original self-hackers, which are monks, sadhus, yogis, and other holy people, these practices are now directed into the cult of productivity and performance. But unlike monastics and other ascetics, and also unlike the countercultural mystics of the 60s and 70s who preceded tech workers in Silicon Valley, religious and spiritual practices do not bind tech workers to a religious community. Rather, tech workers develop an individualistic utilitarian user relationship to religion and religious teachings. And Buddhist teachings and practices become tools to achieve a productive state of consciousness. And Buddhist virtues of compassion, empathy, and equanimity become the skill set of the high-performing tech professional. And indeed, in order to survive in Silicon Valley, religion must conform to the logic and needs of the tech industry. This is what I learned from a Zen priest in Silicon Valley that I call Gil Goldman. So Gil told me that the members of his temple of his Zendo weren't attending services because they were too busy working. So Gil had this idea that he would bring meditation to the workplace. But in order to do that, he had to pitch meditation as a tool for high performance, productivity, and resilience, all the words that he knew tech companies like to hear. And instead of wearing robes to teach, he wore khakis and a button-down shirt and never mentioned that he was a Zen priest. Work replacing religion has collateral effects on religion and spirituality in Silicon Valley. Buddhist priests like Gil struggle with flagging attendance in their temples. Meditation teachers can no longer afford to teach in community centers and retreat centers because of rising living costs that are pegged to tech salaries. Both are forced to sell and service Buddhist meditation to tech companies and repurpose a religious practice into a workplace productivity tool. This means renouncing a sacred, separate, Asian, otherworldly, and ethical religious Buddhism and replacing it with a universalized, whitened, scientized, profitable, efficient, and convenient Buddhism that is in service to the tech industry. The Buddha, I argue, becomes a productivity guru in the religion of work, who is there to awaken tech workers to their full productive potential. I conclude the book by reflecting on the question, what happens to society when its members worship work? So many people ask me, what's wrong with finding fulfillment in work? Isn't it desirable that companies treat employees as whole persons and help them lead healthier and more spiritually fulfilling lives, they ask? Well, I'll admit that I often felt envious of the tech workers that I studied. What would my life be like, I wondered, if UC Berkeley gave me gourmet meals, encouraged me to meditate, and paid for me to spend the weekend at Esalen? What if Berkeley cared about my happiness and wholeness and invested in my productivity like Google does? Well, surely I'd be on my 4th, 5th, or even 6th book by now. Well, Silicon Valley has created what I call Techtopia. Techtopia is Silicon Valley's upgraded social operating system, an engineered society where people find their highest fulfillment in the institution of work. Professionally managed, data-driven, meritocratic, and designed to scale, Techtopia gives tech workers what families, religions, neighborhoods, unions, and civic organizations have failed to deliver in the last 50 years: meaning, purpose, recognition, spirituality, and community. Techtopia has become the 21st century American dream. In Techtopia, people naturally direct their devotion to work because they live in a social ecosystem where all of the community's material, social, and spiritual rewards are concentrated in the institution of work. In Techtopia, work is like a big, powerful magnet that attracts all of the time, energy, and devotion of a community away from the smaller and weaker social institutions or magnets like families, faith communities, and other civic organizations. The problem with Techtopia is that it may be making elite workers happy, whole, and productive, but it leaves everyone else broken. Work monopolizes so much of the time, energy, and devotion of a community and fulfills so many of elite workers' needs that people disinvest from public and civic life. And this corrodes the collective capacity to build and sustain a common good. I spoke to public officials, small business owners, teachers, and faith leaders in Silicon Valley. They all told me a version of the same thing. It's very hard to engage tech workers in the community. Tech workers are politically disengaged, public officials told me. Religious leaders told me that their congregations were suffering because people don't have time to come to religious services anymore. Because workplaces monopolize all of a community's time, energy, and devotion, all other organizations must accommodate to and service the workplace in order to get a share of it. And they have to make compromises to do so. This is what happened in the case of the Zen priest Gil Goldman, who I mentioned earlier. There was no room for the ethical teachings of the Dharma in the tech workplace. Techtopias exacerbate social inequality. Everyone is so busy trying to get Google money and make tech workers productive, happy, and fulfilled that those at the margins of Techtopia get left out. These are large swaths of people who don't have the right educational pedigree, the right skills, the right gender, who are not of the right gender, race, or age to be fully employed by tech companies. These are the house cleaners, the janitors, gardeners, and even the elementary school teachers, people who disproportionately rely on public goods and don't enjoy the privatized perks and handsome salaries of the tech company. So who's taking care of them and who's making sure that they are whole? The answer is no one. Mortality rates from suicide, drug overdose, and alcoholism have risen to an all-time high among non-college educated whites who struggle for good, secure, and dignified work. They are in worse physical, social, and spiritual health than their college-educated white counterparts. They are dying what economists Ann Case and Angus Deaton call deaths of despair. An America in which the physical, social, and spiritual health of its citizens is contingent on scarce good jobs is a precarious place. The Techtopia of Silicon Valley and the deaths of despair, they appear to be worlds apart, but they are really two sides of the same coin. They represent the haves and the have-nots in a society whose material, social, and spiritual wealth is concentrated in work. Techtopia delivers the promise of good work to the meritocratic elite, wholeness of mind, body, and spirit. Deaths of despair happen when good and fulfilling work and the sense of belonging, meaning, and self-work that goes with it disappear. But both realities reveal an America whose hollowed out communities, institutions, and traditions are quickly eroding. Everywhere, that is, except work. Silicon Valley is a bellwether of what happens when we worship work, when we surrender our time, our identities, and our resources, and even our cherished traditions in service to work. It is what will happen if we don't invest in building and sustaining social institutions and traditions that nurture community, identity, and purpose outside of work. Thank you.
Well, thank you for a magnificent talk. And I think it's a very important book, and both in its thesis and in its perspective. I think there are some basic concepts here that we can see the world through. I'd like to start with a moment in the book that most influenced me. You give us this picture of a place like Google or Facebook with tennis courts and Pilates classes, yoga, meditation centers, great food, and so on. But then you describe this labyrinth, the mandala, where you're supposed to slowly walk in a giant circle. And as you do, you're supposed to relinquish your attachments until you get to the center. And at the very center, you find God and you feel the power of God. And then you feel transformed and you slowly, as a different person, walk around back. But Carolyn tells us that right at the center of the mandala is a name, is a logo, Google. You know? And that, I just put the book down. Oh. So you're describing in a way a conversion process, and it made me back up to think about institutions in general, and that we may be in a period of almost the liquefaction of things that we've thought of as solid and steady, the family, you know, the workplace, the church, that we have to, what if these are liquid, in fact? What if there are underlying plates that are moving, and we need to think of them as more changeable than we are in the habit of imagining them as? It's a frightening thought, I find, but an important one. So we see it here, but where else is that happening, I think, is the question that you give us. And it's so in this instance, we're looking at a workplace, and certainly compared to the time bind, which I studied at mid-country, I'm still not naming it, company that still has not gone this route. It's actually a manufacturing company, but I looked it up to see, wow, how far is my company gone? So some do, some don't, but it's not a knowledge industry. It makes stuff. So, and I saw family, a kind of work gobbled up family, so that, but it didn't gobble up church. So that people felt more supported at work than they did at home. They felt in a certain way like they grew more, and people helped them more, but you got home and you were alone and trying your best, but not being rewarded, isn't a growth experience. There are no neighbors, all the neighbors are working. So that there was a denuding of the culture around the family, and elaboration of the culture around work. So it was almost, you say, the amoeba of the idea that you find in full flower. But I'd like to say something, another idea that I think you help us think through, that there is both a narrative elaboration of what matters and where we should put our energy, and caring or empathy. Hold on to that. We're being told what to empathize with and who, and a narrative suppression is what I would call what you're talking about in the last part of your talk, that we're all our attention is being liquidly sort of sucked up in one area, but we are not thinking about children, the elderly, the caregiver. Where did the caregiver come from? The Philippines, well, where are her children? And who's caring for them? What's the care story here? And where is she living? What's her commute? How about the homeless? Right here in Berkeley, and people in jail. There's a narrative suppression of the needs of those that, if you follow Google's Mandela, it leads you away from caring about society and caring about political movements or political activism in the service of those in need in society. So it's a way of sort of taking the narrative and empathy, structure of empathy, and lifting it up to the haves. And that leads me to another point, which is, as you said, the end of your talk, society is increasingly divided. And we sadly have a red America and a blue America. And I've been spending the last 6 years of my life in red America. And what is that story? It's almost the opposite of this story. Religion has been liquefied there too, but it's gone a different direction. And let's back up to get the backstory of this. Red and blue America since 1970s have represent different economies. In general, blue America we live in it here. It's attracts highly educated workers. It's new industry. It's a new service sector. And blue states are in older industries, more vulnerable to offshoring and automation and failing small businesses. Red. Yeah. Right, that's the red story. So upward mobility for blue, downward mobility for red. And even under the 4 years of the Trump presidency, most of the new jobs went to the blue, went to urban educated people in knowledge industries. So, and then there's been a kind of a cultural, of course, divide. And culture on the red side is in a way trying to consolidate the importance of job, but on the other hand, affirming these fallback identities. You're male, oh my goodness, at least that should matter. You know, you're white, at least that should matter. At least you're native born, at least that should matter. Sort of a fallback identities are being defended before the despair, which is growing on the right. So you look at the preconditions for the sanctification of knowledge work, and people are young, they're coming from somewhere else, they're not married, they're, used to go to church, but that's, so they're more vulnerable, you were arguing, to this kind of hot, strong narrative of sanctification. The people that I'm studying, they're older. They're 1 out of 3, I'm just reading, high school educated or less white men is out of the labor force. That doesn't mean they're doing nothing. They are trading drugs. They are fixing refrigerators for friends. There's barter. They are hunting, they're gardening, but they are not socially involved. A lot of them are in prison. And so it's a different demographic. And when I've studied Louisiana for a book called Strangers in Their Own Land, hung around highly religious. There the church is elaborated. There you get your gyms and childcare enveloped within an invitational large church that is beefed up because of the distress in a way around it. But that church, especially evangelical churches, have turned to Donald Trump. And I think we are seeing the sanctification of a charismatic leader. He has become, in a way, a cult leader. I saw this from some of the people. So rallies, their prayers for the J6, that would be the January 6th people who invaded the American Capitol, their prayers, for them, they are sacrificing for the MAGA movement and to be remembered, commemorated at every Trump rally in Michigan in April. An evangelist offered prayer to the precinct delegates at the upcoming Michigan Republican Party convention that would support Trump-endorsed candidates in Jesus's name. Well, so religion is liquid. It can go, into the mandala or Google, or it can also, in a way, lead to a worship of Trump. Rallies have worship music. Honestly, I would add to this that, and this will sound improbable, how could Trump be a worshiped figure? I mean, but suspend that for a minute. What I think we're seeing on the right side of this whole spectrum, and why religion is being sucked into a faith in this man, is that I think we have to think about pride and shame, and that a lot of this downward mobility for people who really believe in the American dream, who really believe that if you work hard, you get there. If you don't succeed, it's on you. And poor people believe this as much as rich people. And Republicans believe it even more than Democrats. Democrats, here you are in the nicer economy on the one hand, and you're softer on yourselves, right? Like, well, we're all victims, and the ideology is not as harsh, actually, and not as individualistic as in Republican areas. So they're feeling bad, and for things they're not responsible for. This is a structurally induced shame in my view, but it's felt. And I think it makes them very susceptible to the kind of things that Trump came along and said, billionaire that he is, no, we are down, we are hard. I am suffering for you. You are suffering, I see it, and I'm your guy. And look how I am suffering. The deep state is attacking me. The nefarious press is attacking me. The Democratic Party is attacking me. The liberal elite is attacking me. I'm taking it for you. People I've come to know feel that. Look how they're, and the FBI rated a poor man, how he is suffering like I am suffering. And he is kind of intuited his way, actually quite brilliantly, into an emotional slot where people, yeah, you're suffering, me too, and he'll say, I'm doing it for you. And when he got COVID, I thought, oh no, he's going to ascend to heaven, but there's a fantasy, there's a belief, and we have to look back when we're looking at the liquefaction of these apparently solid institutions at what the vulnerabilities are that lead a person to what the preconditions are for this to happen, and not say, oh, stupid Trump and oh, stupid people going for him. You have to look much deeper at what you're looking at here, the concept of narrative suppression, of sort of instability behind these basic institutions, their potential for abuse. So all of this is just to play with some of the tools I feel you have given us in this wonderful book. Thank you. Morgan.
Yeah, sure.
Take it away.
I'm so thrilled to be here and really humbled to both be invited here and to follow you. You are certainly a hard act to follow, but I will do my best. I'm going to reflect a little bit more on Silicon Valley because this is a world I'm very familiar with. And I also know it contains multitudes. There's, of course, the physical place, the leafy office park surrounded by parking lots, and beyond those, the sprawling suburbs of Santa Clara County, and elsewhere in the San Francisco Bay Area, many of them largely unchanged for decades, despite the ever-growing influx of workers. Less visibly, there's also the Superfund sites, that left from decades of largely unregulated silicon chip manufacturing, where Silicon Valley got its name, and also the red line neighborhoods marginalized from the tech world's wealth, even as they must contend with its gentrification. Then, of course, there's the imaginary of Silicon Valley, the lavish, high-paying jobs where work and play intermingle, where employees are encouraged to, quote, bring their whole selves to work, as long as their whole selves are also a, quote, good culture fit, and they don't rock the boat, they don't affect the bottom line, where massive wealth is amassed and squandered by scruffy guys, and unfortunately it still is largely men, in t-shirts and hoodies. This imaginary has spread far beyond the bounds of the physical place of Silicon Valley, into hit television shows and movies that dwell on its prosperity and its quirks. It's inspired a profusion of other Silicon X places all around the world, trying to capture the same elusive alchemy. And central to Silicon Valley are, of course, the workers, the people that you have talked to, whose labor constitute the technology industry, many of whom live in those sprawling Bay Area suburbs. They come from all over the country and the world for their jobs. And while they are united in their draw to this industry, and by the way its wealth enables their backgrounds, their worldviews, motivations, and their lived experiences are all as heterogeneous as the many cultures from which they hail. And of course, there's the ideological frame within the valley itself, and one that often becomes invisible to many of the tech workers that perpetuate, sometimes resist, or just exist within it. And this one is most slippery to understand and describe, as ideological frames tend to be, and the one most prone to totalizing, neglecting that worker heterogeneity. And I think your wonderful account, Work, Pray, Code, is focused on this dimension of the technology world, really explicating how Silicon Valley has co-opted some of the functions that religious belief has served in the past and turned it towards capitalistic ends. Now, Silicon Valley continues to be a heterogeneous place with many cultural influences. Your book vividly documents many of the more dominant ones, illustrated with the personal stories of workers themselves. And through these personal stories, you connect Silicon Valley to both the Protestant ethic and to Eastern spiritual traditions, showing how technology workers and the firms that employ them embrace the elision between work, self-optimization, and enlightenment. The thread that you follow in Work, Pray, Code is a thread I know well myself as a former technology worker, and now as a social scientist who is for almost 2 decades now has been studying these ideological underpinnings of this complicated place, industry, and belief system colloquially known as Silicon Valley. And your account also echoes those of a number of other scholars hailing from communication, information science, anthropology, media studies, and beyond, who have similarly turned their analytic eye to this fascinating and fraught side of inquiry. A few I want to just kind of highlight here. Communication scholar Fred Turner has similarly traced the intermingling of work practices and belief systems in the tech world. His 2006 book, From Counterculture to Cyberculture, documents some of the key influences, like the Whole Earth Catalog and network entrepreneurs, particularly Stuart Brand, that bridge counterculture of the 1960s and 70s with its mysticism, as you also describe, and the culture of the hacker culture of the 1980s and beyond. And I would say this influence, in fact, extends to the present. Brand continues to play a central role in defining not only the history of the technology industry, but its future through organizations like the Long Now Foundation, which he co-founded. Turning to the contemporary, Turner also writes about how many of the tech workers who attend Burning Man experience the festival as a kind of religion. And this experience contributes to an ethos of work as life, which he terms the Bohemian Factory. Connecting this world with a famous work ethic that helped define European Enlightenment, Turner states that Burning Man is the Protestant church of Silicon Valley. Like Turner, you find that this generation of technology workers has appropriated a mishmash of Eastern religious concepts and turned it towards spiritual fulfillment and, of course, financial gain via technical tinkering. Likewise, sociologist William Stahl, in his 1990 book, God and the Chip, Religion and Culture of Technology, show how religious tenets have long been appropriated by the technology world, not just for its workers, but also for its consumers. Indeed, the cult-like following that particular companies and leaders, we might think of Apple and Steve Jobs or Tesla and Elon Musk, have not just in Silicon Valley, but around the world, has strong parallels to religious experience. And I would add that the technologies themselves can become charismatic in some of the same ways, fostering the same kind of devotion through the promises they make to change the world. Others have also documented similar ideological, quasi-religious threads within Silicon Valley. Communication scholar Douglas Thomas is one who, in his 2000 book, Hacker Culture, charts the development of two intermingling, but nonetheless distinct cultural histories of the contemporary technology world. One of these cultures was based in Boston, centered on games and open source software. The other, though, is based in the Bay Area, centered on the hardware tinkering in the now famous garages of the peninsula suburbs, with many overlaps into the hippie counterculture. While both exhibited libertarian sensibilities, the West Coast culture had a particularly strong market focus, which I think you also document very well, that marriage with work. Douglas's work in turn leans on the work of not an academic, but a journalist, Stephen Levy, whose 1984 book, Hackers, Heroes of the Computer Revolution, breathlessly documented the core tenets of what hackers themselves called the hacker ethic. And this was an early but explicitly encoded instantiation of work precode's central construct of work as religion. And like Thomas, media theorists Richard Marbrook and Andy Cameron also capture the Silicon Valley zeitgeist of the mid-1990s, though with a focus on critiquing the darker underpinnings of it in their 1995 essay, The Californian Ideology. A decade after that, sociologist Vincent Mosco historicized those ideological analyses in his book, The Digital Sublime, Myth, Power, and Cyberspace, which connects the same cyber utopianism anchored by beliefs that, quote, with the computer, we can transcend time, space, and politics as usual, to more than a century of often racialized and gendered techno-utopianism. While your account primarily connects to literature, sociology, and religion in the workplace, you nevertheless document many of the same deep patterns and practices of Silicon Valley ideologies. Building on Thomas's work, media anthropologist Biela Coleman studies the contours of contemporary hacker culture, including the technological activism of the collective Anonymous, a group that exemplifies the fluid boundaries between work, activism, belief, and life, at least for a certain segment and generation of technology workers. More chillingly, some of the same activists in Anonymous were on the vanguard of the neo-fascist alt-right, exhibiting a particularly virulent dose of the casual sexism and racism that continue to define the tech culture, as also documented by Christina Dunbar Hester, Janet Abate, Nathan Ensminger, and others. Your account doesn't necessarily dwell on the sexism and racism, but it is definitely present in the accounts that you share. And your analysis of how self-optimization becomes a kind of belief system among technology workers has roots in the same all-consuming and often exclusionary passions of these earlier waves of hacker culture. So the accounts I've discussed thus far have largely focused on the ideological level, which your account also does in a really wonderful way, charting the histories and extent of the dominant belief systems of the technology industry. Other accounts, though, turn their focus and adjust their mode of analysis for other structural questions about this region. So UC Berkeley's own Annalise Axinian broadens the frame of analysis beyond cultural norms to organizational and regulatory structures to understand what has enabled Silicon Valley to succeed for nearly 70 years when so many other promising technology regions have floundered. Anno's foundational 1994 book, Regional Advantage, Culture and Competition in Silicon Valley and Route 128, found that Silicon Valley is unique in how extensively technology workers, even from competing companies, freely exchange ideas and create cultures of regional collaboration. When work spills over into life, transcends particular firms and becomes all-consuming. In Chen's frame, when it becomes akin to a religion, It can also enable rapid adaptation and innovation. Anno's later work turns to examining the important role that immigrant labor, particularly from East and South Asia, has played in the development of the technology industry. Chen also describes these immigrant communities, explaining how their religious and cultural ties weaken once they come to Silicon Valley, even as some of the tenets of Buddhism and Hinduism are co-opted for capitalistic ends within their firms. In contrast, in her 2006 book, The New Argonauts, Anno describes how these ties can often be renewed as these immigrants circulate between Silicon Valley and their home countries. So building on this work, scholars like Sylvia Littner and Xinzheng You are charting the deep interconnections, not only of labor, but also of capital investment between Silicon Valley and centers of innovation and manufacture in China, like Shenzhen. Thus, one question I would like to pose to you is to unpack the implications of this brain circulation in bringing this intermingling of spiritual and capitalistic practices around the world, or possibly in pushing back against the religious appropriation that she documents. And a second question that's related brings in some of my own work. People often turn back to their quote unquote roots, including religious roots, when they have children. Was this a pattern that you saw in your participants? And how might it interact with the Valley's famous obsession with youth and its hostility to having children and to family life more generally? And what challenge does family life pose to this religion of work? Finally, there is, of course, the role that the technology companies themselves play in promoting these connections between spirituality and work, which you describe throughout your account, and in particular in the chapter Corporate Maternalism, which I just love that idea of a kind of maternalistic corporation. Again, Xinzheng You, a media scholar focused on Marxist political economic analyses of the technology industry, connects the famous perks of the technology world that you describe in such glorious detail, the mindfulness training, free yoga classes, on-site massages, meals, laundry, commute buses, and more, to some 150 years of corporate strategies to tame worker unrest, court loyalty, and encourage work to bleed over into the rest of life through sometimes quite lavish amenities. And as you also described, the technology world is not the first to shape worker beliefs toward corporate interests and encourage their workers to find higher meaning in their jobs. Indeed, it takes a page from white collar and even blue collar manufacturing, a long-standing capitalistic practice to control not only the labor, but also the hearts and minds of their workers. Even with this corporate maternalism, though, the technology world has very high levels of worker burnout, which you describe in a lot of detail. And this may seem surprising given the amenities that tech workers enjoy. But as you vividly illustrate, when considered in the context of the limitations of investing one's whole self into the corporate bottom line, however it might be camouflaged, it makes a lot more sense. So this leads to another question I have for you. The technology world has famously been overwhelmingly anti-union, focused instead on radical individualism and libertarian sentiments. These management techniques that you describe foster and encourage that anti-union sentiment, but the sentiments have recently been shifting away from this virulent anti-union toward a lot of sympathy with collective action. It's still a small shift, but it is very notable. So I would love to hear your reflections on this shift and whether it shows some of the limitations of this intermingling of spirituality, work, and social lives, and maybe represents an interesting future direction that the technology world will go. Thank you very much.
Morgan for this really tour de force review of the way the literature on Silicon Valley speaks, to this book, and how this book, opens up sort of new possible avenues. So we have about 15 minutes left. So perhaps Carolyn could answer. I'll give you a little bit of time to answer, and then we will turn to the room first for questions, and then maybe if we have time to the online questions.
Okay. Well, Arlie and Morgan, thank you so much for these reflections and these questions. You give me a lot to think about. Yeah, a lot to think about. So let me just comment on some of Arlie, your reflections. I like that term that where you talk about the liquefaction of institutions. And I think that, the story that I'm trying to tell is really about a post-war America story. What's happened in the late 20th century. And some of the institutions that used to be, I came up with this term after, I didn't put it in the book, but I find it to be a very useful term now, to think about what were the alpha institutions of 1950s or 1950s America, right? And so those alpha institutions were religion. They were the Rotary clubs. They were the workplace as well. But there was a panoply, there was a diversity of institutions, so that there wasn't necessarily just one alpha institution, right? There were many, there were multiple. So this was sort of, and here you have this model in the so in 1950s, this is when C. Wright Mills is writing about white collar workers, and this is the rise of the white collar workforce, and the modern corporation is that people work from 9 to 5. And so work itself was literally contained to space of the office because we didn't have cell phones, internet, et cetera, et cetera. But I talk about like how work was also contained simply because there were other sources of fulfillment outside of the workspace. And actually, you couldn't really be somebody. You didn't really have an identity unless you belonged to one of these organizations outside of work. So it was almost like, you would experience social anomie if you only worked all the time.
Yeah. Right.
So if you kind of think about now, if you don't work, you experience social anomie. Who are you if you don't work? I mean, that's the first question people ask you.
Yeah.
What do you do? And so what's happened when when you talk about the liquefaction, I think about it, to me, it's a story about the shift of what happens in post-war, late 20th century America, of a shift in the sort of the social power of different institutions and what's happening. And so it's the growth, at least in these, the blue states that you talk about, and what I call knowledge industry hubs, as the growth and the expansion of the workplace as that increasingly the alpha institution. And then you have, and that I think that all of the other institutions are still sort of finding their footing, right? But they become co-opted.
Yeah.
And I think that the story that you talk about the red states, and here we might think about religion and the religious institution as, okay, 1950s. I mean, in 1950s America, you have theologians on the cover of Time. You put a theologian on the cover of Time, no one would know who that person is, right? Okay, so we're talking about where religion occupies a different social status, a different kind of social power. Well, here, then you talk about what's happening in the red states. And I think that whereas in the blue, here we see religion being co-opted by work. Well, religion's being co-opted by this like white nationalism.
Yes, that's right.
Right.
Yes.
So here it's also a story about truly, yes, the liquefaction of religion, which sort of had more of its own center of gravity. Right. I kind of just think about like many hospitals, many universities were named after Protestant denominations or Catholic, right? So religion sort of served that had a certain kind of social power that extended into these other institutions. Well, today, if you look in the Bay Area, what are the names of all of our hospitals? They're the names of tech companies, the founders of tech companies, right? So it is, I think, that this shifting of the social power of different institutions, and I like that term that you call the sort of liquefaction there. And then Morgan, thank you so much for your comments. You provide me with so many fascinating questions here that I'm not going to be able to get to all of them, but I think the question about the anti-union question is really, really interesting. And I'm really curious to see what happens. And I think that I'm just so curious to see what happens. I mean, I don't know if it's gonna, I don't know if unions are gonna really develop and be able to succeed and thrive in Silicon Valley, because so much, because unions have offer a different narrative of work, right?
Mm-hmm.
Where the worker is oppressed, or the worker might have interests that are different from the company, but everything about the discourse and narrative, the narrative world and culture of the tech company is that your interests are aligned with that of the tech company. And so that everything is used in the language of, everything is posed in the language of voluntarism, choice, like you get to choose your own title. You get to have as many vacation days as you want. You get to, you know what I mean? Like this emphasis on autonomy, and people buy into it. And I think it's such, the greatest irony that when they offer unlimited vacations, those are the companies that, in fact, where people take the least number of vacations, right? It's very, very interesting here. So that's where I'm really curious to see, like, what if the union movement really succeeds. I want to talk a little bit about religion and the family, and what happens is that, so I didn't see people returning to religion, but I think that when it came to the family, I saw different things. First of all, only the women would talk about family. Men generally, I mean, very gendered, no surprise probably to you, right? But the men didn't generally talk about the family, but women did. But here's a really interesting thing that kind of brings into the question of corporate maternalism, is that because of the amenities that the companies would provide to support families, actually having a family might tie one closer to the company. So here's an example of one person that I interviewed who was a single mother. And she told me, so I talked to her several times, and she was a single mother, and I knew, she was a pretty high level, she had held a high level position. She was very busy. And then I talked to her, and I talked to her the second time, and she told me, oh, Carolyn, I decided to leave my job and I'm going to another tech company. And actually the hours are even more demanding. And it's going to be even, it's going to be even more demanding. But guess what? That place actually has an after school care center. So that way I can bring my daughter after work, and we can go there and we can have dinner. Like they could care for her, I could go back to work, and then we could have dinner. So it was this interesting thing, right, where she actually became more dependent on the company. And I think that this is where I have a lot of questions about, I think that many, feminists have often said, like, okay, more childcare, companies should provide childcare, they should have these more expanded services. But I'm sort of thinking, well, what are the consequences of that? Not just on the family, but the larger social consequences as well. So yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. Wonderful responses, and actually the union question and the family question were also online questions.
Okay.
That's perfect, you answered that. So maybe we'll take questions from the audience if there are any.
You described the situation as it exists very well, very accurately. I do wonder about the cause and effect implications of what you're saying. It's like you're saying that these Silicon Valley companies co-opting these religions. They're stealing people away from these religions. My feeling is that religions are dying on their own without this assistance from Silicon Valley. It's that particularly among the more educated people who understand the way the universe works, the types of religions we've had in the US don't really fit that knowledge anymore. Possibly things like Buddhism and other more contemplative religions may still fit in that box. But I just think that, if the Silicon Valley did not exist, religions would be dying on their own, and people would be searching for something else to fulfill them. So I just wonder what you feel about that.
Question. So yes, the pattern of the decline in religious participation affiliation is a general American one. So it's not just happening in these knowledge industry hubs like Silicon Valley. And so I don't necessarily, so here I'd say I don't necessarily say that there's a causal relationship, right? But when I talk about the decline in religious participation, in many ways, religion is here a stand-in for civic participation and civic institutions. And religion really being the one that Americans are the most active in. So that when you see the institution, the one kind of community civic institution that Americans traditionally have affiliated with and have been participated with the most, and we see general American civic participation declining. In some ways, religion is sort of like a what's the word that I'm thinking of? But it's mapping that overall trend, right? But the point also is that when I ask people in Silicon Valley, so where do you find community outside of work? They all say the same thing to me. It's a challenge. It's a challenge. And so in some ways, the company expanding and providing for all of one's social and spiritual needs, this has become a really convenient solution. And I argue that, these companies have mastered and provided to scale a meaningful life like no other social institution. And so I see, so to get back to your question, I don't necessarily see this causal relationship, but these two things are happening. There is a relationship that what's happening in one place, there's something that's going on between the two. There's a relationship between the two, although it may not be causal.
Excuse me for interrupting, but you can both be right. In other words, what's created is a void, bowling alone. Putnam is saying the kind of decline of civic life. And so church is dying on its own, but that creates a void that's useful to the company.
Yeah, so here's my line to Putnam, is that people actually in Silicon Valley, they're not bowling alone. They're bowling at work. Yeah. And so this is like what I think is like the big thing that's really missing here is that work is now taking on all of those functions that these other civic institutions have. And so if in our surveys, we're not talking about, it's organizing the book clubs, it's organizing all of these other social events, right? So, yeah.
And it's disassembled the wife's role. It's taken the role of the traditional woman, gobbled it up. It's right there at work.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's corporate. Well, if your wife was your mother, right? Sometimes she is. Yeah. We won't go there. But I mean, like what I think about is like watching Mad Men and, Don Draper, he had his secretary who's like arranging his life and, getting his meals, doing all this stuff for him. What tech companies have done is they've created Don Draper's secretary to scale for everyone else. So that now you have.
That's right.
Yeah, so many startups are, what do you miss that your mom was doing for you? Right. Stereotypically your mom, right? So many startups are geared towards that.
We have time, and thank you very much. That was really a wonderful conversation. Really, it delivered everything that it promised, in spite of the very bleak conclusions, right down to the last minute. But I want to thank our audience for being here. Thank you, Julia and Chuck, for helping make this event a success. And thank you, of course, to our wonderful panelists. And we'll see you again, Matrix. Thanks.